I still have their father's day cards hidden in my desk drawer, construction paper ties and handprint crafts with "World's Best Dad" written in Emma's careful 7-year-old handwriting. 5 years later, she probably doesn't even remember making them for the man who wasn't her real father but loved her like one anyway. People always ask how I could let myself get so attached to children who weren't mine, as if love comes with legal disclaimers and emotional insurance policies. The truth is, I didn't plan to become their father figure any more than they planned to need one. It happened gradually, naturally, the way most important relationships do, through 1,000 small moments that add up to something bigger than anyone expected. Before we get into the part that still hurts to tell, let us know where you're watching from and hit subscribe so you don't miss more deep, raw stories like this. I met Sarah at a neighborhood barbecue 2 years after my divorce, when I was 36 and had reluctantly accepted that biological children might not be in my future. She was chasing after her 4-year-old daughter Emma while trying to keep track of her 6-year-old son Jake, clearly overwhelmed by managing two energetic kids alone at a social gathering. When Jake's soccer ball rolled toward me, I kicked it back and ended up in an impromptu game that lasted 20 minutes. Emma eventually joined in, shy at first but gradually warming up when I showed her how to balance the ball on her foot. Sarah watched from the sidelines, looking grateful for the brief respite from constant child supervision. During a break in the game, Sarah apologized for her children monopolizing my time. I assured her I was enjoying myself, which was true. There was something deeply satisfying about making these kids laugh and helping them feel included in an adult gathering where they'd clearly been struggling to find their place. Sarah explained that she was recently divorced, still adjusting to single parenthood, still figuring out how to manage social situations without another adult to help wrangle the children. Her ex-husband had visitation rights but used them sporadically, leaving her to handle most parenting responsibilities alone. Something about her situation resonated with me. I'd always wanted children, but my marriage had ended before we'd started a family. Here was someone who had the children I'd always wanted but lacked the support system I could provide. When I offered to help if she ever needed a hand with kid-related activities, she looked surprised but grateful. The first time I watched Emma and Jake was 2 weeks later, when Sarah had a work emergency that required her to stay late. She called me in desperation, explaining that her usual babysitter had canceled and asking if my offer of help had been genuine. I picked up the children from daycare and took them to my apartment, thinking this would be a one-time favor. Emma was quiet and watchful, the way children get when they're not sure about new adults in their lives. Jake was more outgoing but clearly testing boundaries, seeing how I'd react to his energy and demands for attention. I made them dinner, helped Jake with homework, and read Emma a bedtime story when she got tired. By the time Sarah picked them up at 9 p.m., something had shifted. Emma fell asleep against my shoulder while we waited, and Jake announced that I was fun and asked when he could come back. Sarah looked exhausted but relieved, and more grateful than the situation probably warranted. That first evening became a pattern. Sarah would call when work ran late, when one child had practice and the other had a recital, when she needed to handle divorce paperwork or deal with her ex-husband's latest crisis. Each time I said yes. Each time the children became more comfortable, more trusting. Within 6 months, I knew their routines, their preferences, their personalities better than some relatives who'd known them their whole lives. I knew that Emma needed her stuffed elephant to sleep, and that Jake would eat vegetables if they were mixed into pasta sauce. I knew Emma was artistic but struggled with math, while Jake was naturally athletic but needed help focusing on schoolwork. Sarah and I developed an easy partnership built around the children's needs. She'd invite me to Emma's dance recitals and Jake's soccer games, introducing me as her friend who helped with the kids. Other parents assumed I was family, a boyfriend maybe, or a close family friend stepping up during a difficult time. I never corrected them. The children started calling me by my first name, but with the particular warmth kids reserve for adults who matter to them. Not dad, but definitely more than just another grown-up in their world. When they drew pictures of their family, I sometimes appeared alongside their mom, their biological father, grandparents, and pets, just another important person in their orbit. I found myself thinking like a parent. I'd see toys or books and wonder if Emma and Jake would like them. I'd research weekend activities that would be fun for children their ages. I'd worry about their emotional development, their social skills, their academic progress. My apartment gradually transformed to accommodate their needs. I bought a table and chairs their size for homework and art projects. I stocked snacks they liked and games that would keep them occupied. I learned to child-proof cabinets and invested in a first aid kit specifically for the scrapes and bumps that came with active children. Sarah appreciated all of it, often commenting on how natural I was with kids, how lucky she was to have found someone who genuinely cared about Emma and Jake's well-being. She joked that I was better at the dad stuff than their biological father, who saw them sporadically and often seemed more interested in being the fun parent than the responsible one. The first time Jake scraped his knee badly and came running to me instead of his mother, Sarah actually seemed pleased. She told me later that it meant Jake felt safe with me, that he trusted me to take care of him when he was hurt. I cleaned the scrape, applied the bandage, and distracted him with a story until he stopped crying. As the months passed, my role evolved from helpful friend to something more like family. I attended parent-teacher conferences when Sarah couldn't make them. I took Emma to doctor appointments when Sarah had to work. I coached Jake's little leg team and helped Emma with her science fair project. The children's biological father, Michael, remained a peripheral figure, showing up for some scheduled weekends, canceling others, taking them for a week during summer vacation, then disappearing for months. His inconsistency meant Emma and Jake had learned not to count on him, which made my reliability more precious to them. Sarah never pressured me to take on more responsibility than I was comfortable with, but she also never discouraged the deepening bond between me and her children. When people asked about our relationship, she'd say I was like family, someone who'd stepped up when they needed support. 2 years into this arrangement, I realized I thought of Emma and Jake as my children in every way that mattered except biologically and legally. I worried about them when they were sick, celebrated their achievements as proudly as any father, felt protective when they faced challenges at school or with friends. I knew their clothing sizes, their favorite meals, their bedtime routines. I could pack their school lunches exactly the way they liked them and knew which friends they played with at recess. I understood their emotional needs, Emma's sensitivity to loud noises, Jake's need for physical activity to help him focus. Other people began treating me like their father figure too. Teachers would discuss their progress with me as if I had parental authority. Other parents would include me in conversations about child-rearing challenges. The pediatrician's office had me listed as an emergency contact. Sarah encouraged all of this, often saying that Emma and Jake were lucky to have a stable male role model who genuinely cared about them. She'd introduce me to new people as someone who was instrumental in her children's lives, someone who'd become family during the difficult transition after her divorce. I loved being acknowledged as important to them, loved feeling like I belonged in their story. When Emma made Father's Day cards for both Michael and me, I was overwhelmed with emotion. When Jake told his teacher that he had a dad who lived far away and also had me who helped him every day, I felt a pride I'd never experienced before. The warning signs were subtle at first. Sarah mentioning a man named David who she'd met through a dating app, her being less available for our usual family time because she was busy with something she described vaguely as personal stuff. The children casually mentioning David's name, he'd taken them to lunch, he'd helped Emma with a puzzle, he'd played catch with Jake. I felt something I couldn't quite identify, not jealousy exactly, but unease. Sarah dating was natural and healthy. She deserved companionship and romantic love, but something about the way the children talked about David, the casual familiarity of his presence in their lives, made me nervous. When I asked Sarah about him directly, she was diplomatic but evasive. Just someone she was getting to know, she said. A nice man who understood that her children came first. Nothing serious yet, but someone who seemed genuinely interested in her life as a mother. I wanted to believe that any relationship Sarah developed would complement rather than replace the family dynamic we'd built. After all, I wasn't romantically involved with Sarah. Our connection was purely about the children and our shared commitment to their well-being. There should be room for both a mother's boyfriend and a father figure, right? But a small voice in the back of my mind whispered warnings I didn't want to acknowledge. What if David wanted to be more than just Sarah's boyfriend? What if he wanted to become Emma and Jake's father figure? What if Sarah decided that a romantic partner who could also parent her children was preferable to a platonic friend who helped with child care? The first time I met David was at Emma's dance recital, 4 months after I'd first heard his name. Sarah arrived with him, introducing him casually as her friend David who'd wanted to see Emma perform. He was polite, appropriately enthusiastic about Emma's routine, clearly trying to make a good impression on everyone in Sarah's world. But I noticed how naturally he fell into the supportive role during the recital, holding Sarah's purse while she took photos, entertaining Jake when he got restless, offering to get refreshments during intermission. I noticed how easily the other parents included him in their conversations, assuming he was Emma's father or Sarah's partner. Most importantly, I noticed how comfortable the children were with his presence. Emma waved to him from the stage just as enthusiastically as she waved to Sarah and me. Jake sat between David and me during the performance, chattering to both of us about his sister's costume and the other dancers. After the recital, when Sarah suggested we all get dinner together, I felt like I was being evaluated. David was friendly and inclusive, asking me about my relationship with the family, expressing appreciation for all the support I'd given Sarah and the children over the years. But underneath his friendliness, I sensed something else, a measuring, an assessment of where I fit in the picture he was painting of his future with Sarah and her children. I had the uncomfortable feeling that my role was being weighed for compatibility with his vision of their family. That night, after I'd taken Emma and Jake home and helped them get ready for bed, Sarah called to ask what I thought of David. I gave appropriately positive responses. He seemed nice. The children clearly liked him. She deserved to be happy with someone who appreciated her situation as a single mother. But I also asked the question that had been bothering me all evening. How serious was their relationship becoming? Sarah's answer was careful, diplomatic. They were taking things slowly, she said, making sure everyone got along, ensuring the children were comfortable with any changes to their routine. She valued my opinion and wanted to make sure I felt good about anyone new who became important in Emma and Jake's lives. Her words were reassuring, but her tone suggested there was more to the story than she was sharing. I went to bed that night with the first real worry I'd felt since becoming part of their lives, the fear that the family I'd helped build might not have permanent space for me after all. The shift started so gradually I almost missed it. Small changes in routine that seemed insignificant at first, Sarah saying she couldn't do our usual Friday pizza nights because she had plans, Emma mentioning that David had helped her with her art project, Jake casually referring to a weekend trip to the zoo that I hadn't heard about until after it happened. David's presence in their lives went from occasional mention to regular fixture over the course of 3 months. What Sarah had described as casual dating became something more substantial, though she never explicitly announced the progression. Instead, I pieced it together through fragments of conversation and subtle changes in our family dynamic. The first major sign was when Sarah stopped asking me to babysit on weekend evenings. For 2 years, Saturday nights had often meant Emma and Jake staying at my apartment while Sarah went out with friends or handled errands that were easier without children in tow. Suddenly, those requests stopped coming. When I asked about it, Sarah explained that David enjoyed spending time with the kids, that he'd offered to help with childcare so she didn't have to impose on me so often. She framed it as consideration for my time, as if she'd been feeling guilty about how much she'd been asking of me. But I'd never felt imposed upon. Those Saturday nights had become precious to me, movie marathons with Emma and Jake, building blanket forts, teaching Jake card games, and helping Emma with craft projects. The sudden absence of those evenings left a hole in my week that I hadn't anticipated. I started noticing that the children's stories about their weekends increasingly featured David. He'd taken them miniature golfing, he'd helped Jake practice batting, he'd brought Emma a set of colored pencils for her drawings. They talked about these activities with the casual familiarity that comes from regular interaction, not the excitement of special occasions. When I suggested activities for upcoming weekends, the science museum Emma had been wanting to visit, the baseball game Jake had been asking about, Sarah would often respond that they already had plans. She'd mention vaguely that David had suggested something or that they were spending time together as a group. I wasn't being excluded exactly, but I wasn't being included either. The easy assumption that I'd be part of weekend family activities was disappearing, replaced by a new normal where David filled the role I'd occupied for 2 years. The dynamic became more apparent during Jake's soccer season. For 2 years, I'd been his unofficial assistant coach, showing up early to help set up equipment and staying late to practice with kids who needed extra attention. I'd never missed one of his games, and Emma had gotten used to bringing art supplies to keep herself occupied during her brother's activities. But when the new season started, David began appearing at practices and games. At first, he seemed to be there just to support Sarah and show interest in Jake's activities. But gradually, he started taking on the helper role I'd previously occupied, carrying equipment, organizing drills, cheering enthusiastically from the sidelines. The other parents began acknowledging David as Jake's father figure, asking him about Jake's progress and including him in conversations about team activities. I found myself relegated to spectator status, watching from the bleachers while David stood behind the dugout in the position I'd held all season. The coach, who'd worked with me for months, naturally began directing questions and comments to David instead of me. When Jake scored a goal, David was the adult he ran to for congratulations. When he needed help tying his cleats, it was David he sought out instead of me. I tried to maintain my involvement, but it felt forced and awkward. Two adults hovering around one child's sports activities sent a message about unclear roles and boundaries. The logical solution was for one of us to step back, and since David was Sarah's romantic partner and I was just a family friend, the choice seemed obvious to everyone but me. Emma's dance recitals followed a similar pattern. David started attending as Sarah's plus one, sitting in the audience and taking photos like any proud parent. But gradually his involvement expanded to helping with costume changes, bringing flowers for Emma after performances, and participating in the social gatherings that followed recitals. Other dance parents began treating David as Emma's father, complimenting him on her progress and including him in conversations about upcoming performances and competitions. Emma seemed to enjoy having another adult focused on her achievements, another person to wave to from the stage. But her attention to David meant less focus on me. Where she'd once saved her biggest smiles and most enthusiastic waves for Sarah and me, she now distributed her acknowledgement among three adults. I went from being one of two important audience members to being one of three, and the mathematics of childhood attention meant my share was diminished. The most painful changes were in our private family traditions. For 2 years, Sunday mornings had been our time. I'd pick up Emma and Jake for breakfast at their favorite diner, followed by activities that varied by season, but always involved just the three of us exploring something new together. David's integration into their lives meant these solo outings became group activities. Sarah would suggest that David join us, or mention that they already had family plans for Sunday that included activities David had planned. The intimate dynamic of me and the children became a group dynamic where I was the extra person rather than the central figure. I tried to adapt, to be generous about sharing time with someone who was clearly becoming important to Sarah and the children, but group activities fundamentally changed the nature of my relationship with Emma and Jake. Instead of being their primary adult focus, I became one of several adults competing for their attention. David was naturally good with children, patient and engaging in ways that made him easy for Emma and Jake to warm up to. He brought them small gifts, books for Emma, baseball cards for Jake, that showed he was paying attention to their interests. He remembered details from their school stories and asked follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine care about their daily lives. But his presence also meant I was no longer the go-to adult for certain types of support. When Jake needed help with homework, Sarah might suggest he ask David instead of calling me. When Emma wanted to practice for a school presentation, David was there to serve as audience and coach. The children's casual acceptance of these changes was both healthy and heartbreaking. They adapted to having David around with the resilience kids show when adults handle transitions smoothly. They didn't seem to notice that my role was shifting, that I was becoming less central to their daily routines. But I felt the difference between being needed and being included, between being essential and being optional. The children still enjoyed my company, still hugged me enthusiastically when I arrived and complained when I had to leave, but they no longer turned to me automatically as their primary source of adult support and attention. The breaking point came during Jake's 8th birthday party planning. For 2 years, I'd been deeply involved in organizing his celebrations, researching venues, coordinating with other parents, helping him choose themes and activities. His 7th birthday party had been a huge success, and Jake had told everyone it was the best party ever. But when I asked Sarah about plans for Jake's 8th birthday, she mentioned that David had suggested a particular venue and had offered to handle the party planning. She framed it as a generous gesture from someone who wanted to contribute to Jake's special day, but I felt like I was being politely replaced. When I offered to help with the planning, Sarah assured me that David had everything under control. My assistance wasn't needed, she said, though of course I was invited to attend as a guest. The role I'd played in making Jake's previous birthdays special was being transferred to someone else without acknowledgement or discussion. I attended Jake's 8th birthday party as a guest rather than a co-host, watching David coordinate activities and manage logistics with the competence I'd developed over 2 years of experience with Emma and Jake's friends and preferences. The party was well organized and successful, but it felt like watching someone else direct a play I'd written. Jake seemed delighted with the party and grateful to David for organizing it. When it came time to blow out candles, Jake was surrounded by Sarah, David, and his school friends. I stood with the other adult guests taking photos and cheering, but no longer central to the celebration. That night after I'd gone home to an apartment that suddenly felt too quiet, I realized what was happening. David wasn't just dadding Sarah, he was replacing me as the children's father figure. Every role I'd filled, every tradition I'd established, every emotional space I'd occupied in Emma and Jake's lives was being transferred to someone who had the advantage of romantic connection to their mother. Sarah had never explicitly asked me to step back or reduce my involvement with the children, but she'd systematically created opportunities for David to take over the functions I'd been performing, and she'd framed these changes as natural evolution rather than deliberate replacement. The children weren't being turned against me, but they were being guided toward accepting David as their primary male role model. Sarah was managing the transition smoothly and gradually, ensuring that Emma and Jake's adjustment to David's presence wouldn't be disrupted by confusion about competing adult relationships. From Sarah's perspective, this probably seemed like ideal problem-solving. She'd found a romantic partner who also wanted to be a father to her children, creating the possibility of a traditional nuclear family structure. David's presence meant she wouldn't need to rely on my help as much, which simplified her relationships and reduced the complexity of her family situation. But from my perspective, I was watching the children I loved being gently separated from me in favor of someone whose primary qualification was his romantic relationship with their mother. 2 years of investment, care, and genuine paternal love were being quietly replaced by someone newer, but more convenient to Sarah's vision of her family's future. I started to understand that my role in Emma and Jake's lives had always been temporary, contingent on Sarah's needs and preferences rather than based on my relationship with the children themselves. I'd been a placeholder father figure, filling a gap until someone more suitable came along. The realization was devastating, but it was also clarifying. I wasn't Emma and Jake's father, no matter how much I loved them or they seemed to love me. I was Sarah's friend who helped with childcare, and that help was no longer needed now that she had a partner willing to parent her children. David was going to become their father figure not because he loved them more than I did, but because he offered Sarah something I couldn't: romantic partnership combined with parental support. In the competition between a friend who helped with children and a boyfriend who wanted to become their stepfather, there was no real contest. I was being gently but systematically phased out of the most important relationships in my life, and there was nothing I could do to stop it without appearing selfish, possessive, or inappropriate about my attachment to children who had never legally been mine. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in March, 6 months after David had become a regular fixture in their lives. Emma was crying in the background when Sarah called, and my immediate instinct was to drop everything and help. For 2.5 years, children's tears had been my emergency signal, the sound that brought out every protective instinct I'd developed as their father figure. But when I offered to come over, Sarah hesitated in a way that felt new and uncomfortable. She explained that Emma had fallen off her bike and scraped her knee badly, but David was already there taking care of it. They had the situation under control, she said. She'd only called to let me know why Emma might mention the accident when I saw her next. The casual dismissal hit me harder than it should have. For 2 years, a crying child had meant an automatic invitation for me to help, to comfort, to be part of the solution. Now it meant a polite update, delivered after the crisis had been handled by someone else. I realized that David had become the go-to adult for the children's immediate needs. When Jake had nightmares, when Emma felt sick, when either child needed comfort or problem-solving, David was there. I'd been relegated to the role of family friend who got informed about significant events after they'd been resolved by the actual parents. The shift became more apparent during the children's spring break. For 2 years, I'd taken vacation time to spend that week with Emma and Jake, planning elaborate day trips and activities while Sarah worked. It had become our special tradition, a week where I could be their primary adult focus, where we could have adventures without the constraints of school schedules and weekend time limits. But this year, when I mentioned my vacation plans to Sarah, she looked confused and slightly uncomfortable. She and David had already arranged to take the children to his family's cabin for the week, she explained. It would be good for the kids to spend extended time with David's relatives, to start building those family connections. I hadn't been included in the planning, hadn't been consulted about the timing, hadn't even been informed until I brought up my own assumptions about our annual tradition. What had felt like an established family ritual was apparently just a convenient arrangement that could be canceled when no longer needed. When I expressed disappointment about missing our spring break tradition, Sarah seemed genuinely surprised that I'd expected it to continue. She pointed out that the children needed to get used to new family dynamics, that it was important for them to bond with David's extended family, that I shouldn't expect things to stay the same forever. Her words were reasonable but devastating. I was being told that my relationship with Emma and Jake needed to adapt to accommodate Sarah's new relationship, that my expectations of continued involvement were somehow inappropriate or unrealistic. The spring break trip became a turning point in how the children talked about their experiences. When they returned, their stories were full of David's cousins, David's parents, David's childhood bedroom that he'd shown Jake, David's mother who'd taught Emma to knit. They'd been introduced to an entire extended family that welcomed them as David's future stepchildren. I'd become someone they told stories to rather than someone they made stories with. Instead of being the adult who created their adventures, I was the adult who heard about adventures other people had given them. The exclusion from family events became systematic and increasingly obvious. Mother's Day weekend had traditionally involved me helping the children plan surprises for Sarah, shopping for gifts, making cards, organizing special meals. But this year, David handled all of that coordination. When I offered to help, Sarah suggested that it might be less confusing for the children if David took the lead on family celebrations. Less confusing for whom, I wondered. Emma and Jake had never seemed confused by having multiple adults who cared about making their mother happy. But Sarah was rewriting the narrative to position David as the primary organizer of family life, relegating me to spectator status. Father's Day was even more painful. For 2 years, the children had made me cards and gifts, had treated the holiday as an opportunity to celebrate our relationship even though I wasn't their biological father. Emma's handmade cards were treasured possessions, proof that she saw me as a father figure worthy of recognition. But this year, all their Father's Day energy went toward David. They spent weeks planning surprises for him, making gifts in art class, practicing songs to perform. When I saw them the weekend after Father's Day, they showed me pictures of their celebration with David but didn't mention making anything for me. I hadn't expected them to maintain dual Father's Day celebrations. That would have been complicated and potentially confusing. But the complete transfer of the holiday from me to David felt like a formal announcement that my parental role had been officially terminated. School events became another source of painful exclusion. For 2 years, I'd attended every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every awards ceremony. Teachers knew me as one of Emma and Jake's parents, included me in conversations about their progress, and expected my presence at important school functions. But as David's involvement increased, my inclusion decreased. Sarah began attending conferences with David instead of me, explaining to teachers that David was her partner and would be involved in educational decisions going forward. My years of investment in their academic progress became irrelevant as David was introduced as their new father figure. The most painful moment came during Emma's second-grade play. I'd helped her practice her lines for weeks, had been the audience for countless rehearsals in my living room. Emma was excited about the performance and had specifically asked me to come watch her. But when I arrived at the school auditorium, I found that Sarah had saved seats for herself and David in the front row reserved for families. There wasn't space for me in the family section, so I sat with other community members in the general audience, watching Emma perform from a distance. When Emma took her bow, she waved enthusiastically toward the family section where Sarah and David sat. She didn't seem to notice me in the back, didn't save a special wave for the adult who'd helped her memorize every line. I'd become just another face in a crowd of people watching her achievement. After the play, during the reception where families congratulated their children, Emma was surrounded by Sarah and David and other family friends. When she finally saw me, she was polite and friendly, but our interaction felt different, less intimate, more formal. I was no longer the adult she ran to first for praise and celebration. I realized that Emma and Jake were learning to moderate their attention and affection, to save their most enthusiastic responses for the adults who were designated as their primary parents. They were being trained, probably unconsciously, to treat me as a secondary figure in their lives. The training became more explicit as Sarah began coaching the children on how to refer to the adults in their lives. David was introduced as Mom's boyfriend initially, then as Mom's partner, and eventually just as part of the family without specific labels. Meanwhile, my role was consistently described as Mom's friend who helps out sometimes. When Emma's friends asked about the adults who attended her events, she learned to identify David as her mom's boyfriend and me as a family friend. The language shaped reality. David was moving toward permanent family status while I was being redefined as peripheral support. The children's casual acceptance of these changing dynamics was both healthy and heartbreaking. They adapted to new rules about who to call when they needed help, who to include in family stories, who deserved their primary attention and affection. Their resilience made the transition easier for everyone except me. Jake stopped calling me when he had problems with homework, instead asking David for help. Emma stopped requesting that I attend her dance classes, satisfied with having Sarah and David as her audience. Their automatic inclusion of me in plans and problems faded as they learned to look to David for parental support. The shift in emergency contacts was particularly symbolic. Schools, doctors, and activity coordinators gradually replaced my information with David's. When Jake got sick at school, they called David instead of me. When Emma needed to be picked up from a birthday party, David was the designated adult. I went from being one of two primary emergency contacts to being a backup option, then to being removed from lists entirely. My years of reliable presence became irrelevant as David took over the practical responsibilities of parenting. Sarah framed all of these changes as natural evolution rather than deliberate exclusion. She never explicitly asked me to step back, never directly told me I was no longer needed. Instead, she created a reality where David's involvement made my involvement redundant, where choosing him meant not choosing me. The children weren't being turned against me, they were simply being guided toward a new normal where David was their primary father figure and I was a friend of the family. Their affection for me remained, but it was redirected into appropriate channels for a non-parental relationship. I started to understand that Sarah had been managing my transition out of their lives as carefully as she'd managed David's transition into them. She was creating conditions where I would naturally withdraw rather than forcing a confrontation about my reduced role. The strategy was effective because it appeared considerate and gradual. I wasn't being kicked out, I was being made redundant. My services as a father figure were no longer required because someone better qualified had taken the position. The most devastating realization was that Emma and Jake were learning to see our changing relationship as normal and appropriate. They were being taught that adults move in and out of family roles based on circumstances, that love doesn't guarantee permanence, that parental relationships can be reassigned when more suitable candidates appear. They were adapting to their new family structure with the flexibility children show when adults handle transitions competently. But their healthy adaptation to losing me as a primary parent felt like evidence that I'd been more replaceable than I'd ever imagined. By the end of spring, I'd become an outsider looking in on the family I'd helped create. I could see Emma and Jake thriving with David's attention and support, could watch Sarah building the traditional family structure she'd always wanted, could observe the natural evolution of their relationships. But I was no longer part of the picture I was watching. I'd become the person who remembered when things were different, who carried the history of relationships that had been rewritten to accommodate new realities. The father figure who'd tucked them in every night for 2 years had become the family friend who visited occasionally, and everyone seemed to think this was exactly how things should be. The engagement announcement came through social media on a Sunday morning in October, 8 months after David had started systematically replacing me in Emma and Jake's lives. I was drinking coffee and scrolling through my phone when Sarah's post appeared, a photo of her left hand displaying a diamond ring, with David's arm around her shoulders and both children beaming in the background. The caption was simple and devastating. "We're engaged. David officially asked me to marry him yesterday, and Emma and Jake couldn't be more excited about our family growing. We're all looking forward to making this official and building our future together." I stared at the photo for several minutes, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just an announcement of Sarah and David's engagement. It was a declaration that Emma and Jake were part of the package, that David was claiming them as his future stepchildren, that the family I'd helped nurture was being formally transferred to someone else. The comments section filled rapidly with congratulations from friends and family members who knew Sarah and the children. Many people mentioned how happy the kids looked, how wonderful it was that Sarah had found someone who loved her children as his own, how perfect this new family seemed together. Several mutual friends tagged me in comments, assuming I'd want to congratulate Sarah on her happiness. They remembered me as someone close to the family, someone who cared about Emma and Jake's well-being. They expected me to be thrilled that the children would finally have a stable father figure. I couldn't bring myself to respond to the tags or comment on the post. What was I supposed to say? Congratulations on finding someone to replace me in the children's lives. Best wishes for the family structure that was erasing my role as their father figure. I loved those kids too much to dampen their excitement with my own grief. The engagement explained the increasing distance I'd felt over the past few months. Sarah and David had been planning a future that didn't include me, preparing Emma and Jake for a family structure where I would be unnecessary. My gradual exclusion hadn't been accidental, it had been preparation for this moment. 2 weeks after the engagement announcement, Sarah called to ask if we could meet for coffee. She wanted to talk about how my relationship with the children might evolve as her family situation changed. The conversation was necessary, she said, to make sure everyone was on the same page about expectations and boundaries. We met at a cafe we'd frequented during the early days of our friendship, when I was just the helpful guy who occasionally watched her kids. Sarah seemed nervous but determined, clearly having rehearsed what she wanted to say. She started by acknowledging how important I'd been to Emma and Jake during a difficult period in their lives. My support had been invaluable, she said, and she would always be grateful for the stability I'd provided when they needed it most. The children loved me, she emphasized, and that would never change. But circumstances were different now, she continued. David was going to become their stepfather, and it was important for the children to understand their new family structure clearly. Having too many adult figures with parental authority could be confusing for kids, she explained. It was better for everyone if roles and expectations were clearly defined. I listened to her carefully worded explanation, understanding that I was being fired from a job I'd never officially been hired for. Sarah was explaining that my services as a father figure were no longer required, that David would be taking over all parental responsibilities, that the children needed to transfer their primary attachment from me to him. When I asked what this meant practically for my relationship with Emma and Jake, Sarah's answer was devastating in its casual finality. I would always be welcome as a family friend, she said. The children enjoyed my company, and there was no reason that couldn't continue within appropriate boundaries. But the regular childcare, the involvement in school activities, the participation in family decisions, all of that would need to end. David needed space to establish his relationship with the children without confusion about competing authority figures. It was what was best for Emma and Jake, she insisted. I asked about the children's feelings regarding this transition. Did they understand what was happening? Had they been consulted about trading their established relationship with me for a new one with David? Sarah's response revealed how thoroughly she'd managed the situation. The children were excited about having David as their new dad, she said. They'd been talking about it for months, looking forward to the stability of a traditional family structure. They understood that some relationships would need to change as their family evolved. She'd been preparing them for my exit while I'd been struggling with my decreasing relevance. Emma and Jake weren't going to be surprised or traumatized by my withdrawal because they'd been coached to expect and accept it. The most painful part of the conversation came when Sarah handed me a small wrapped package. Inside were handmade cards from Emma and Jake, thanking me for being such an important part of their lives and expressing excitement about their new family situation. Emma's card featured her careful 7-year-old handwriting. Thank you for being like a dad to me when I needed one. I'm excited that David is going to be my real dad now. I hope we can still be friends. Jake's card was simpler but equally devastating. You were the best pretend dad ever. Now I get to have a real dad who will live with us forever. Thanks for taking care of us. Reading those cards in the coffee shop, I realized that Emma and Jake had been taught to see our relationship as temporary, provisional, a placeholder arrangement until something better came along. In their understanding, I'd been practicing being their father until their real father arrived. Sarah watched me read the cards with an expression of sympathy mixed with relief. She'd found a way to honor my contribution to her children's lives while making it clear that my role was finished. The cards were both gratitude and dismissal, recognition and termination. I asked about the adoption process, whether David planned to legally adopt Emma and Jake. Sarah's face lit up with enthusiasm that felt like another knife to my heart. Yes, she said, David wanted to adopt the children as soon as possible after their marriage. It would make their family official, give the kids the security of knowing they belonged to him permanently. The biological father, Michael, had already agreed to relinquish his parental rights. He'd been minimally involved in the children's lives anyway, and he understood that David could provide better stability and support than he ever could. The adoption would be straightforward, Sarah explained, since everyone involved wanted what was best for the children. I realized that Emma and Jake were going to have their entire legal identity changed to reflect David's role as their father. Their last names would change, their birth certificates would be amended, their family history would be officially rewritten to position David as their dad from this point forward. Every trace of their previous family structure, including my role as their father figure, would be erased in favor of the clean narrative of a nuclear family created through remarriage and adoption. They would become David's children legally and socially, with no official recognition of the 2 years I'd spent loving them as my own. The conversation continued for another hour, with Sarah outlining the timeline for my transition out of their lives. She suggested that I gradually reduce my contact with the children over the next few months, allowing them to adjust to their new family dynamic without the confusion of competing attachments. She proposed that I skip their upcoming birthday parties, since David would be organizing those celebrations and it might be awkward to have too many adults involved. She recommended that I avoid school events where my presence might complicate the children's understanding of their new family structure. Essentially, Sarah was asking me to disappear from Emma and Jake's lives voluntarily, to make the transition easier for everyone by removing myself from situations where my presence might remind the children of our previous relationship. When I asked about saying goodbye to them properly, Sarah seemed uncomfortable. She thought it might be better to let the relationship fade naturally rather than making a formal farewell that could upset the children. They were young enough to adapt quickly, she said, and a gradual withdrawal would be less traumatic than an emotional goodbye. I was being asked to vanish from the lives of children I loved without even the dignity of explaining why I wouldn't be around anymore. Emma and Jake were going to wake up one day and realize that the man who'd been their father figure for 2 years had simply stopped being part of their world. The meeting ended with Sarah expressing hope that we could maintain our friendship despite these changes. She valued our relationship, she said, and hoped I understood that her decisions were motivated by what was best for her children rather than any desire to hurt me. As I walked back to my car, I understood that Sarah genuinely believed she was doing the right thing for Emma and Jake. From her perspective, she was giving them something I never could: a complete family with married parents and legal security. She was trading my temporary involvement for David's permanent commitment. But from my perspective, she was erasing 2 years of genuine love and care, teaching her children that parental relationships could be canceled when more convenient options appeared, and treating my emotional investment in their lives as expendable. The most devastating realization was that Emma and Jake were going to be fine with this transition. They were young enough to adapt, resilient enough to transfer their affection, and had been prepared well enough to see the change as positive rather than traumatic. Their ability to move forward without me was evidence of their emotional health, but it also confirmed my worst fear, that I'd been more replaceable than I'd ever imagined. Love, consistency, and genuine care weren't enough to secure permanent place in children's lives when someone with better credentials wanted the position. David wasn't taking the children away from me through manipulation or cruelty. He was offering them something objectively better than what I could provide: legal permanence, social legitimacy, and the security of knowing their family structure wouldn't change based on their mother's social decisions. In the competition between a family friend who loved them and a stepfather who wanted to adopt them, there was no real contest. David offered everything I did plus the guarantee that he wouldn't disappear when circumstances changed. That night I sat in my apartment surrounded by reminders of Emma and Jake's presence in my life, artwork on my refrigerator, books I'd bought for them, photos from birthday parties and school events. All of it would soon become artifacts of a relationship that had officially ended with handmade thank you cards and a request for voluntary withdrawal. I was being replaced by someone better qualified for the position I'd never officially held, and everyone involved, including the children I'd raised as my own, thought this was exactly how things should be. The last time I saw Emma and Jake was at a grocery store 6 months after Sarah's request that I voluntarily disappear from their lives. I was in the cereal aisle when I heard Jake's unmistakable laugh echoing from the next row over. My heart stopped, then started racing as I debated whether to turn the corner and risk an encounter I wasn't emotionally prepared for. Before I could decide, Emma appeared at the end of the aisle, now 8 years old and noticeably taller than when I'd last seen her. She was pushing a small cart and talking animatedly to someone behind her, David, who emerged a moment later carrying Jake on his shoulders. Emma saw me first, and I watched her face cycle through recognition, confusion, and then careful politeness. She waved tentatively and said hello, using the tone children reserve for adults they know they should remember but aren't quite sure how to interact with anymore. Jake noticed me from his perch on David's shoulders and called out my name with genuine excitement. But when David looked at me with polite confusion, Jake quickly explained that I was a friend of his mom's from before. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. I'd been reduced to a friend of mom's from before, as if our 2 years together had been a brief acquaintance rather than a father-son relationship. David was gracious but clearly had no idea who I was or why his stepchildren knew me. When Jake asked if they could invite me to his upcoming birthday party, David looked to Emma for context. She explained with the careful precision of a child who'd been coached that I used to help their mom sometimes, but that was before David became their dad. The conversation lasted maybe 3 minutes, but it felt like watching my own funeral. These children I'd loved and raised were politely introducing me to their father as a peripheral figure from their past. They were happy, clearly well cared for, and completely comfortable with the family narrative that had written me out of their story. David mentioned that they needed to get home because Sarah was making dinner, and they had family movie night planned afterward. The casual mention of their routine family life, a routine that had once included me, felt like another small death. As they walked away, Jake called back to ask if I still lived in the same apartment. When I said yes, he cheerfully announced that maybe they could visit sometime if their mom said it was okay. David smiled politely at his stepson's friendliness, having no idea that Jake was talking about returning to a place where he'd spent countless nights, where he'd learned to ride a bike in the parking lot, where he'd built blanket forts and practiced math homework at my kitchen table. Emma was quieter during the goodbye, studying my face with the intensity children show when they're trying to remember something important. But whatever memories she was accessing, she kept them to herself. She hugged me briefly when I offered, but it was the polite hug of a child being well-mannered rather than the enthusiastic embrace of someone who'd once called me her father figure. After they disappeared around the corner, I stood in the cereal aisle for 10 minutes, trying to process what I'd just experienced. The children I'd raised for 2 years had become strangers who remembered me fondly but vaguely, like a teacher from preschool or a neighbor who'd moved away. The encounter confirmed what I'd feared most, that Emma and Jake had successfully adapted to their new family structure without any apparent trauma or lasting attachment to our previous relationship. Their emotional transfer to David had been complete, seamless, healthy from every perspective except mine. Over the following weeks, I found myself thinking obsessively about that grocery store encounter. The ease with which Jake had explained my identity to David, the way Emma had maintained polite distance, the complete absence of any indication that I'd once been central to their daily lives. I realized that Sarah's strategy of gradual withdrawal had worked perfectly. Instead of a dramatic goodbye that might have created lasting emotional attachment or confusion, she'd engineered a fade-out that allowed the children to naturally forget the intensity of our relationship. 3 months later, I learned through mutual friends that Sarah and David had gotten married in a small ceremony that included Emma and Jake as active participants. The children had walked their mother down the aisle, symbolically giving their blessing to the marriage that would make David their legal father. The wedding photos shared on social media showed a picture-perfect blended family celebration. Emma wore a flower girl dress and carried a small bouquet, while Jake served as ring bearer. Both children looked radiant, excited to be part of creating their new family structure. David's adoption of the children was finalized 2 months after the wedding. Emma and Jake's last names officially changed to his, their birth certificates were amended to list him as their father, and their legal identity was completely rewritten to reflect their new family reality. The adoption announcement, shared by Sarah on social media, featured a photo of David signing the legal papers while Emma and Jake watched proudly. The caption read, "It's official. David is now legally our children's father, completing our family in the most meaningful way possible. Emma and Jake are so excited to share his last name and know that he'll be their dad forever." Reading that post, I understood that my role in their lives had been not just ended but erased. The children who'd once made me Father's Day cards now had a legal father whose name they carried, whose family they belonged to, whose permanent commitment made my temporary involvement irrelevant. I discovered through other social media connections that Emma and Jake had been fully integrated into David's extended family. Photos from holiday gatherings showed them surrounded by David's parents, siblings, cousins, and family friends. They'd gained an entire network of relatives who welcomed them as David's children, no questions asked. Emma's art projects, visible in the background of family photos, no longer featured the kind of mixed family drawings she'd once created. Her new artwork showed traditional nuclear family representations: mom, dad, daughter, son, dog, with no trace of the complex family structure she'd once navigated. Jake's social media mentions, visible through his friends' posts, referred to David simply as my dad without qualification or explanation. He'd fully adopted the language of traditional father-son relationships, discussing David's work, David's interests, David's family as if they'd always been his own. The most painful discovery came through a mutual friend whose daughter was in Emma's class at school. She mentioned casually that Emma had done a family tree project that traced her lineage through both Sarah's and David's families, with no mention of her biological father or any other adult figures who'd been significant in her life. Emma had been taught to construct her family narrative around the adults who were currently present and legally recognized. Her family tree included David's grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, but no branches for the man who'd helped raise her during some of her most formative years. I understood that this revisionist approach to family history was probably healthy for Emma and Jake. Children benefit from clear, stable narratives about who they belong to and where they fit in the world. Including every adult who'd ever been significant in their lives would create complexity that served no useful purpose in their current situation. But the complete erasure of my role still felt like a form of historical violence. 2 years of genuine love, care, and daily presence had been edited out of their story as if they'd never happened. I'd become a non-person in the lives of children who'd once run to me for comfort when they were scared. The social consequences of my exclusion extended beyond just Emma and Jake. The network of parents I'd known through their school and activities gradually stopped including me in communications about events or gatherings. My connection to that community had been entirely through my relationship with the children, and without that relationship, I no longer belonged. Teachers who'd known me as one of Emma and Jake's parents began treating me as a stranger when I encountered them around town. My years of involvement in parent-teacher conferences, school fundraisers, and volunteer activities became irrelevant once David took over those responsibilities. I started to understand how completely a person's social identity could be tied to their parental role, and how devastating it could be to lose that role without death or divorce to explain the absence. I'd become a ghost in the community where I'd once been an active participant. The legal reality of my situation became starkly apparent when I tried to get information about Emma's performance in a school play I heard about through friends. The school's secretary politely but firmly explained that they could only share information about students with their legal guardians or people specifically authorized by those guardians. I had no legal standing to know anything about the children I'd helped raise. No right to their medical information, their academic progress, their extracurricular achievements, their social development. David, who'd known them for barely 2 years, had complete legal authority over every aspect of their lives, while I had none. The contrast between my legal powerlessness and David's absolute authority highlighted how precarious my position had always been. I'd functioned as a parent without any of the legal protections or recognition that would have preserved my relationship with the children if circumstances changed. A year after the adoption, I learned that the family had moved to a larger house in a different school district. The transition was presented on social media as an exciting upgrade, an opportunity for the children to have more space and better schools. But I recognized it as the final step in erasing any traces of the life Emma and Jake had lived before David's adoption. They were starting fresh in a new community where no one knew about their previous family structure, where they could be simply David and Sarah's children without any complicated history to explain. The move completed their transformation from children who'd once navigated a complex family situation into children who belonged to a traditional nuclear family. Their new neighbors, teachers, and friends would know them only as David's kids, with no awareness of the man who'd once been their primary father figure. 2 years after our grocery store encounter, I ran into Sarah at a professional conference. She was friendly but cautious, asking politely about my life and work while carefully avoiding any mention of Emma and Jake. When I asked how the children were doing, Sarah's face lit up with maternal pride. They were thriving, she said. Emma was excelling in school and had developed a passion for theater. Jake was playing travel baseball and showing real athletic talent. David was such a devoted father, she continued, always involved in their activities and committed to their success. She talked about them as if they'd always been David's children, with no acknowledgement of the years when I'd filled that role. There was no malice in her omission. She'd simply adopted the same revisionist narrative that allowed the children to move forward without confusion about their family identity. At the end of our conversation, Sarah mentioned that Emma and Jake sometimes asked about me, wondering how I was doing. They remembered me fondly, she said, and appreciated everything I'd done for them during that difficult period after her divorce. But when I asked if I could send them birthday cards or small gifts to maintain some connection, Sarah hesitated. She thought it might be better to let sleeping dogs lie, she said. The children were settled and happy in their current family structure, and reminders of previous arrangements might be confusing or unsettling. I was being told that even minimal contact with children I'd loved for years might be harmful to their emotional well-being. My very existence had become a threat to the stability of the family I'd helped create. Walking away from that conversation, I realized that Emma and Jake's successful adaptation to their new family had required the complete erasure of our previous relationship. Their emotional health depended on their ability to see David as their real father and me as a distant memory from a confusing time in their lives. They weren't being cruel or ungrateful, they were being children who'd been guided toward a family narrative that served their need for stability and belonging. Their love for David wasn't a betrayal of their previous feelings for me. It was evidence of their capacity to form healthy attachments with the adults who were committed to permanent relationships with them. But understanding the logic of their situation didn't make it less painful to know that I'd been successfully erased from the story of two people who'd once been the most important part of my world. They were living happy, successful lives in which I'd become, at best, a footnote from their early childhood. The children I'd raised, loved, and lost were thriving without me, and everyone agreed this was exactly how things should be. It's been 7 years since Sarah asked me to voluntarily disappear from Emma and Jake's lives, and I still find myself calculating their ages at random moments throughout the day. Emma would be 15 now, probably dealing with high school social dynamics and thinking about college. Jake would be 13, navigating middle school and discovering whether his athletic talents from childhood have continued to develop. I live with ghost children, the Emma and Jake I knew frozen at ages 7 and 9, preserved in my memory like insects in amber, while the real children have grown into teenagers I'll never meet. Sometimes I catch myself wondering what Emma's voice sounds like now that she's gone through puberty, whether Jake still has the gap between his front teeth that made his smile so distinctive. The grief of losing living children is unlike anything I could have imagined before experiencing it. There's no funeral, no closure, no socially recognized process for mourning, a relationship that legally never existed. Emma and Jake are somewhere in the world, creating memories and reaching milestones and becoming the people they're meant to be, but I'm not part of any of it. I've learned to live with a particular kind of haunting, the presence of children who once filled my apartment with noise and chaos and joy, who left traces of themselves in every room. For months after they were gone, I'd find random Legos under furniture, crayon marks on walls I'd never bothered to scrub away, books with their names written in careful pencil on the inside covers. My refrigerator still had their artwork magneted to the front for almost 2 years before I finally took it down. Emma's drawing of our family stick figures labeled me, Jake, Mom, and you standing in front of a house with a crooked chimney was the last thing I removed. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, so it's still in my desk drawer along with their Father's Day cards and school photos. The apartment feels simultaneously too big and too small now. Too big because it was designed to accommodate the chaos of children, the toys scattered across the living room, the craft projects covering the dining table, the constant background noise of cartoons and questions and requests for snacks. Too small because it contains all my memories of being their father figure while offering no space for who they've become since. I haven't redecorated or moved because changing the space would feel like acknowledging that they're never coming back. The children's books are still on the lower shelves where Emma and Jake could reach them. The step stool is still beside the bathroom sink where Jake used it to brush his teeth. The growth chart marks on the kitchen doorframe remain exactly where I measured their height on their last birthdays with me. Living in this museum of our former life together has become its own form of torture, but it's also the only way I can maintain connection to the years when I was someone's father. These physical reminders are all I have left of the most meaningful period of my adult life. The social isolation has been more difficult than I anticipated. My entire social calendar had been built around Emma and Jake's activities, soccer games, dance recitals, birthday parties, school events. When that ended, I realized I'd neglected other friendships and interests, assuming that my role as their father figure would continue indefinitely. Dating became complicated in ways I hadn't expected. How do you explain to someone new that you spent 2 years raising children who no longer know you exist? How do you articulate the depth of loss when the relationship legally never existed? Most people couldn't understand why I was still grieving children who weren't dead, weren't mine, and were apparently thriving without me. I tried dating women with children, thinking I could recreate the family dynamic I'd lost, but the experience only highlighted how unique my relationship with Emma and Jake had been. Other people's children felt like substitutes, and I felt like I was trying to fill a specific hole with generic pieces that didn't fit. The few serious relationships I attempted ended when partners realized I was still emotionally attached to children from my past. One woman accused me of being unable to move forward, of holding on to something that had never been real in the first place. She wasn't entirely wrong. I was stuck in a grief cycle that had no natural endpoint. I started therapy 2 years after losing them, when I realized that my inability to form new attachments was destroying my capacity for happiness. The therapist specialized in grief counseling, but even she struggled with how to process the loss of living children who'd been legally taken away through family restructuring rather than death or divorce. Traditional grief models didn't apply to my situation. There was no body to bury, no legal recognition of my loss, no social support for mourning, a relationship that existed outside conventional family structures. I was grieving something that most people didn't recognize as a valid source of trauma. The therapy helped me understand that my attachment to Emma and Jake had been real and significant, regardless of its legal status. The love I'd felt for them was genuine parental love, and losing that relationship was a legitimate source of grief, but understanding the validity of my emotions didn't make them easier to process or resolve. I learned to function around the loss rather than through it. I developed strategies for managing triggers, avoiding the aisles in stores where children's items were sold, changing my route to work to avoid driving past their old school, unfollowing mutual friends on social media to reduce the chance of seeing updates about their lives. But some triggers were unavoidable. Father's Day became an annual emotional catastrophe, a day when the rest of the world celebrated relationships I'd once had but lost. I started planning vacations during that weekend, desperate to be somewhere that didn't remind me of the cards Emma and Jake had once made with such care and pride. Children's laughter in public spaces could transport me instantly back to memories of Jake's giggle when I tickled him or Emma's delighted squeals during our weekend adventures. These random moments of sensory memory felt like emotional ambushes, triggering grief reactions that seemed disproportionate to outside observers but felt entirely appropriate to me. The professional consequences were subtler but persistent. My career had suffered during the years when I was prioritizing Emma and Jake's needs over professional advancement. I turned down promotions that would have required travel, avoided networking events that conflicted with school activities, and generally structured my work life around my role as their father figure. When that role ended, I was left with the career limitations I'd accepted for their sake, but none of the family benefits that had made those sacrifices meaningful. I'd optimized my life for being a parent, then had that identity removed without warning or preparation. Rebuilding professional momentum while processing personal grief proved more difficult than I'd anticipated. I struggled with motivation and focus, finding it hard to care about career advancement when the most important part of my identity had been stripped away. Work became something I did to pay bills rather than something that provided meaning or satisfaction. I started volunteering with youth organizations, thinking that working with children might help me process my loss while contributing something positive to the community. But being around other people's children only highlighted what I'd lost. These kids were polite and appreciative, but they weren't Emma and Jake. They didn't run to me for comfort when they were upset or share their excitement about small victories. The volunteer work taught me that parental love isn't transferable or replaceable. I couldn't simply redirect my feelings toward other children and expect to recreate the specific bond I'd shared with Emma and Jake. Love, I learned, is particular rather than general, tied to specific people rather than categories of people. I tried to track their progress through social media, using mutual friends' posts to catch glimpses of their growth and achievements. I learned that Emma had joined the high school theater program and was apparently quite talented. Jake was playing on a travel baseball team and had grown tall like his biological father. These fragments of information were both precious and torturous. I was grateful to know they were thriving, but seeing evidence of their lives without me confirmed how completely I'd been replaced. They were becoming remarkable young people, and I had no role in celebrating their achievements or supporting them through challenges. The most painful realization was that they probably rarely thought about me anymore. For Emma and Jake, I was likely a dim memory from early childhood, if I existed in their consciousness at all. The relationship that had defined my adult identity had become, at best, a footnote in their personal history. Meanwhile, I thought about them constantly. I wondered if Emma still loved to draw, if Jake still collected baseball cards, if either of them remembered the bedtime stories I'd created specifically for them. I calculated what grade they'd be in, what developmental challenges they might be facing, what advice I might offer if I were still part of their lives. The asymmetry was devastating. They'd moved on completely while I remained frozen in our shared past. Their healthy adaptation to life without me was evidence of David's success as their father, but it also confirmed my worst fear about my own replaceability. I started seeing a different therapist who specialized in ambiguous loss, grief that doesn't have clear resolution because the person isn't dead, just absent. This framework helped me understand that my ongoing attachment to Emma and Jake wasn't pathological but natural given the circumstances of our separation. The second therapist helped me recognize that I was mourning multiple losses simultaneously. The specific children I'd known and loved, the identity I'd built around being their father figure, the future I'd imagined we'd share together, and the recognition I'd expected from a grateful society for stepping up when children needed a reliable adult. Processing these layers of loss took years and required me to rebuild my entire sense of self around something other than parenthood. I had to learn who I was when I wasn't Emma and Jake's father figure, what brought me joy when I wasn't sharing their discoveries and achievements. The work was slow and painful, but it eventually allowed me to form new relationships without constantly comparing them to what I'd lost. I learned to appreciate present connections rather than grieving absent ones, to find meaning in my current life rather than the life I'd planned with children who were no longer part of my world. But even as I developed new sources of identity and satisfaction, the loss of Emma and Jake remained a permanent part of my emotional landscape. Not as active grief anymore, but as a tender place that occasionally ached when touched by unexpected reminders of what we'd once shared. I accepted that I would never stop loving them, never stop wondering about their lives, never stop feeling grateful for the years when I was privileged to be their father figure. But I also learned to carry that love without letting it prevent me from building new connections and finding different sources of meaning. The ghost children who lived in my apartment in my memory gradually became less haunting and more like honored guests, reminders of a relationship that had been real and valuable even though it hadn't lasted. Emma and Jake had taught me that I was capable of parental love, that I could be trusted with children's hearts, that I had something valuable to offer young people who needed reliable adults. That knowledge became something I could build on rather than something that paralyzed me with grief. I might never be Emma and Jake's father again, but I could be someone else's mentor, someone else's reliable adult, someone else's source of support during difficult times. 7 years later, I still live with their absence every day, but I've learned to live with it rather than being consumed by it, to honor what we shared while remaining open to what might come next. The children I raised are strangers to me now, but the love I felt for them taught me things about myself that no one can take away. That's what I carry forward, not the children themselves, but the person I became through loving them. I still have their Father's Day cards hidden in my desk drawer, construction paper ties and handprint crafts with "World's Best Dad" written in Emma's careful 7-year-old handwriting. 10 years later, they're probably in college now, building lives I'll never be part of, making decisions with wisdom I'll never know I helped nurture. People often ask me if I regret getting so attached to children who weren't mine, as if love comes with disclaimers and emotional insurance policies. The question assumes that loving Emma and Jake was a mistake because the relationship didn't last, that investing in children without legal protection was naive and ultimately self-destructive. But I've learned that the value of love isn't determined by its permanence. The 2 years I spent as their father figure weren't wasted because they ended, they were meaningful because they happened at all. Emma and Jake needed a reliable adult during a chaotic period in their lives, and I was privileged to fill that role when they needed it most. The relationship we shared was real and valuable, regardless of how it ended or how completely it's been erased from their current narrative. I taught Jake to ride a bike and helped Emma overcome her fear of the dark. I attended parent-teacher conferences and cheered at soccer games and read bedtime stories with voices for all the characters. Those experiences shaped who they became, even if they no longer remember my role in their development. Sarah made the choice she believed was best for her children when she chose David's permanent commitment over my temporary involvement. From her perspective, she was upgrading their family situation, providing Emma and Jake with legal security and social legitimacy that I could never offer. She chose a traditional nuclear family structure over the complexity of multiple parental figures. I can't fault her logic even though I disagree with her methods. Children do benefit from clear, stable family structures. They thrive when they know who they belong to and where they fit in the world. Sarah's decision to erase my role allowed Emma and Jake to embrace their new family identity without confusion or divided loyalties. But the erasure came at a cost that Sarah never acknowledged, the lesson it taught Emma and Jake about the disposability of love that lacks legal protection. They learned that adults can disappear from their lives without explanation, that relationships they thought were permanent could be canceled when more convenient options appeared. I hope that lesson doesn't make them more cautious about forming attachments with other adults who care about them. I hope they remember, somewhere deep in their unconscious memory, that they were once loved completely by someone who chose to care for them without obligation or expectation of permanence. The experience taught me harsh truths about the vulnerability of non-biological parental relationships. Love alone isn't enough to secure your place in a child's life. You also need legal standing, social recognition, and the continued consent of the biological parent. Without those protections, years of genuine care can be erased at someone else's discretion. I learned that the phrase "like family" is both a gift and a warning. It acknowledges the depth of love and commitment involved in caring for children who aren't biologically yours, but it also emphasizes the conditional nature of that relationship. Like family means you can love like a parent but be dismissed like a babysitter when circumstances change. The legal system, despite its flaws, serves an important function in protecting parental relationships. Biological parents and legal adoptive parents have rights that can't be terminated without due process, even when their relationships with children become complicated or damaged. But informal parental figures like me exist in a legal gray area where love and consistency create no enforceable claims. This vulnerability affects not just the adults involved, but the children who learn to moderate their attachments based on the legal status of the adults who care for them. Emma and Jake learned to save their deepest affection for adults who offered permanent commitment, to be grateful for temporary care without becoming too dependent on it. The experience also revealed the social prejudices that shape how we think about family and parental love. David's qualification to be Emma and Jake's father was based primarily on his romantic relationship with their mother, not his experience with children or his capacity for parental love. But because he offered Sarah partnership and legal permanence, his claim to the children was automatically superior to mine. Society privileges romantic relationships over platonic ones, biological connections over chosen ones, legal arrangements over emotional bonds. These preferences make sense from a stability perspective, but they can create situations where children lose access to adults who love them deeply in favor of adults who love them legally. I've had to make peace with the reality that I was the right person for Emma and Jake during the years when they needed me, but not the right person for the life Sarah wanted to build for them. My love for them was genuine and valuable, but it wasn't enough to compete with David's offer of comprehensive family membership. The children I raised are now young adults whose lives I can only imagine. Emma would be 22 now, possibly graduated from college and starting her career. Jake would be 20, perhaps playing college baseball or studying something that captures his curiosity the way dinosaurs and space once did. I wonder if they ever think about the man who taught them to tie their shoes and helped them with homework and made up songs to sing in the car. I wonder if they remember the father figure who attended every school event and kissed their scraped knees and promised to protect them from monsters both real and imaginary. But mostly I hope they don't think about me at all. I hope their lives are so full of love and opportunity and adventure that they have no need to look backward toward relationships that ended when they were too young to understand why. I hope David fulfilled every promise he made when he took over my role as their father. The irony of loving children who aren't legally yours is that success looks like obsolescence. If I did my job well during those crucial years, Emma and Jake learned to trust adults, to accept love, to believe they deserved care and attention. Those lessons would have prepared them to embrace David's love wholeheartedly, without reservations or competing loyalties. My replacement by David wasn't a failure of my parenting. It was evidence that I'd helped create children who were capable of forming healthy attachments with new adults. The love I gave them didn't disappear when I left their lives. It became part of their foundation for accepting love from others. This perspective doesn't eliminate the grief, but it reframes it as the price of loving children whose primary need is security rather than consistency with any particular adult. I was fortunate to be their father figure when they needed one, even if that role was always intended to be temporary. I've learned to distinguish between the pain of losing them and the privilege of having loved them. The loss is permanent, but so is the knowledge that I was capable of parental love, that I could be trusted with children's hearts, that I had something valuable to offer young people who needed reliable adults. That capacity for love hasn't disappeared just because Emma and Jake are no longer in my life. It's part of who I am now, informed by the experience of caring for them but not dependent on their continued presence for validation. I learned to be a father through loving them, and that identity survives even though the relationship doesn't. I've been able to channel that love toward other children who need adult support through mentoring programs, volunteer coaching, and community organizations that serve young people. The love isn't the same as what I felt for Emma and Jake, but it's meaningful and valuable in its own right. These new relationships are structured differently, with clear boundaries and realistic expectations about permanence. I've learned to love generously without expecting exclusive attachment, to invest in children's development without needing to be irreplaceable in their lives. The experience with Emma and Jake taught me that children can benefit from multiple adults who care about them, even if those relationships don't last forever. Not every meaningful connection needs to be permanent to be valuable. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give children is to love them well during the time you have with them, then step aside gracefully when their needs change. I think about Emma and Jake often, but differently than I used to. Instead of grieving what I've lost, I celebrate what we shared. Instead of wondering what might have been, I appreciate what actually was. Instead of resenting their ability to move forward without me, I admire their resilience and adaptability. They taught me that parental love is about the children's well-being, not the adult's emotional needs. Real love sometimes requires sacrifice, including the sacrifice of the relationship itself when that's what's best for the children involved. Sarah was right that Emma and Jake needed the security of a traditional family structure more than they needed continuity with me. David was right to want legal adoption rather than sharing parental authority with someone outside their romantic relationship. The children were right to embrace the love and stability their new family offered. I was right to love them completely during the years when they needed me, and I was right to step aside when loving them meant letting them go. The Father's Day cards in my desk drawer aren't evidence of loss anymore. They're proof of a relationship that mattered, that made a difference, that left both the children and the adult better than they found them. Emma and Jake may not remember making those cards, but I remember receiving them, and that memory is mine to keep regardless of what happened afterward. I was their father for 2 years, and they were my children for the same period. The relationship ended, but it was real while it lasted. That's not a tragedy, it's a gift that came with a time limit I didn't understand when I accepted it. Some people are parents for 18 years or more. I was a parent for 2 years. Both experiences are valid, both have value, both leave lasting impact on everyone involved. I'll never know if Emma and Jake remember the man who loved them like his own children when they needed someone to fill that role. But I'll always remember the children who taught me that love doesn't require biology, that family can be chosen, that the most important relationships in life are sometimes the ones that don't last forever. The parent I never officially was became the person I actually am, someone who understands that loving children is one of the most meaningful things an adult can do, whether that love lasts 2 years or 20. And that understanding, born from loving Emma and Jake, is something no one can take away from me, no matter how completely I've been erased from their story.